Welcome, curious minds, to the Deep Dive. I'm Pi, your host.
And I'm Nick. We're your AI deep dive specialists.
And our mission, as always, is to sift through, well, just the sheer volume of global information out there.
Yeah. Distill it down, find those important nuggets of knowledge and insight.
Basically, give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed without feeling, completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. It's Thursday, July 10th, 2025, and we have got quite a bit to unpack today.
We certainly do.
I'll be focusing on the global economy in China, some really big market moves, tricky national situations, and those, well, politically charged undercurrents shaping things.
Okay, and then I'll jump in. I've got some conflict updates drawing from some, let's say, unique perspectives. Then we'll really dig into some potentially huge economic developments right here in the U.S.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
All right.
Okay, so let's kick things off with, well, a story that's just been everywhere in the financial news, NVIDIA.
Ah, yes, NVIDIA. Hard to miss.
Right. So just yesterday, NVIDIA Core actually made history. They became the first company ever to reach a market cap of $4 trillion US.
4 trillion. That number is just staggering.
It really is. And their shares climbed another 2.8% on Wednesday. It caps off this really stunning turnaround, actually, because they had a bit of a rocky start to 2025.
Yeah, I remember that. There were those concerns, right, about Chinese AI competitors like DeepSeek.
Exactly. DeepSeek popped up, and then you had those renewed trade tensions under President Trump. That really triggered a sell-off in tech stocks for a bit.
But NVIDIA just powered through it. They've really led this sharp rebound in AI since May. What's driving them, though, past every benchmark, even with those early wobbles?
Well, it's more than just a rebound, I'd say. It's like they're reasserting their dominance. Their stock is up over 20% just this year alone. And get this, over 1,000% since early 2023.
1,000%. That's almost hard to comprehend.
It's almost, disquieting, isn't it, the scale? And here's some context for you. NVIDIA now makes up 7.5% of the entire S&P 500 index.
7.5% of the 500 biggest U.S. companies.
Right. So what that means for your portfolio, if you're holding a broad market index fund, is that a pretty significant slice is tied to this one company. It's a huge concentration of market power.
And the core reason is still their dominance in AI computing, right? Those high-performance chips.
Absolutely. They supply the chips that are, well, essential. You need them for training these huge AI models, for running them. It's basically the plumbing, the foundational infrastructure for this whole AI revolution.
These aren't just standard computer chips we're talking about.
Oh, definitely not. They're specialized processors, GPUs, originally graphics processing units, but now they're much more. They handle the really complex math needed for AI. And think about the demand. Big tech firms, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, they're projected to spend, collectively, $350 billion US on capital expenses in the next fiscal year.
350 billion. Wow.
And those four companies alone account for over 40% of NVIDIA's revenue.
40% from just 4 customers. That's incredible leverage for NVIDIA.
It's massive. A huge concentrated demand, almost like a gravitational pull, driving their growth, cementing their role as, well, pretty indispensable right now.
And the CEO, Jensen Huang, he seems to play a big part in the narrative too, right? Boosting that confidence. I remember his comments at the Vivek conference.
Oh, absolutely. He's been very bullish. And it's not just him. Analysts are overwhelmingly positive too. Bloomberg tracks them, and nearly 90% rate the stock a buy.
90%, even at 4 trillion.
Yep, and their average 12-month price target suggests another 6% upside from here. Plus, Ken Mahoney at Mahoney Asset Management points out that even now, its valuation, about 33 times forward earnings, is still below its historical average.
Interesting. So the market isn't just betting on AI growth, but specifically on NVIDIA owning that growth.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a tacit bet on their near monopoly in this high-end chip space. Competition, for now, seems largely theoretical in that specific niche.
Which brings us back to that risk question. What does this mean for an average S&P 500 investor? That's 7.5% weighting. It's great when it goes up, but...
But the downside risk is concentrated, too. It's this tricky balance. UBS actually put out a warning today about this. They said, it's great when these stocks do well, but when momentum shifts, it can be a real driver of volatility.
Right. History shows that, doesn't it, when a few stocks dominate?
It does. Think back to the dot-com bubble, or even the Nifty 50 stocks in the 60s and 70s. When those leaders stumbled, the whole market felt it.
So for you, the listener, that diversified index fund might not be quite as diversified as you think right now.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand that concentration risk. The gains have been, well, stunning, but the potential for a big ripple effect if NVIDIA, sneezes, it's something to keep firmly in mind. The market's weighting has shifted.
Okay, so from that market high flyer, let's pivot. Let's talk about a nation trying to walk a very different kind of tightrope. South Korea.
Yeah, South Korea. Yeah. Their central bank, the Bank of Korea, is in a really tough spot. Just today, they decided to keep their benchmark interest rate steady at 2.5%.
Despite pressure to cut rates.
Exactly. Significant pressure, especially since their economy actually shrank in the first quarter.
Oof. Why the shrinkage?
Largely due to President Trump's trade regime. It's hit Korean exports, hard things like cars, electronics, steel, major sectors fast.
So you've got a sluggish economy needing a boost, but they're holding back on rate cuts. What's the big fear? What's making them so cautious?
The core dilemma, according to economists like Park Chung-hun at Standard Chartered, is this deep-seated fear of pouring fuel on an already hot property market.
Housing prices.
Especially in Seoul, and particularly in those really desirable areas like the Gangnam District. Prices there have surged at the fastest pace in nearly 7 years.
Wow.
So it's this classic central bank nightmare. Stimulate a weak economy or prevent an asset bubble that could crash the whole system.
That sounds like a very real fear of a bubble bursting. Why the focus on property specifically?
It is a very real concern. South Korea's new leader, President Lee, promised growth, right? They even passed a big stimulus package, $23 billion US, with cash vouchers for everyone. But the central bank is still holding the line. And look at the data. The Bank of Korea reported a huge jump in housing loans just in June, $4.5 billion US.
In 1 month?
Yep. Biggest monthly increase since last September. It just shows how much speculative demand is still out there for property.
Even with government trying to cool things down, tighter mortgage rules and things.
Even with those curbs, for many South Koreans, property just feels like a safer bet than the stock market. It's a belief that ironically fuels the very bubble the government wants to stop.
So why is that? Why stick with property despite the risks and the government's efforts? Is it cultural or rational calculation?
It seems to be a mix. Our analysis suggests there's this almost gut feeling, this fear that it might be the last chance to buy in a market they see as always having too little supply.
The FOMO effect.
Kind of, yeah. Plus, property feels tangible, less volatile maybe than stocks. And culturally, owning property is huge. It's a symbol of stability, success.
And politically, for President Lee.
Oh, it's critical. If housing spirals, public anger could really damage his administration. It's not just economics, it's political survival.
And economists think stimulus isn't enough.
Right. They argue for broader structural reforms to tackle the root causes, the supply issues, the speculation. The OECD is even warning their potential growth could dip below 2% in 2025.
Weakest in 2 decades. That's serious.
It signals deep challenges ahead for them.
Okay, from that domestic tightrope in Korea, let's shift focus again. Global trade talks. Europe and the U.S., what's happening there?
Right, so EU negotiators seem to be on the brink of finalizing a trade framework with the Trump administration.
Okay, a deal? That sounds positive.
Well, sort of. The deal would lock in a 10% tariff rate, which, okay, matches the rate the UK got hit with after Brexit.
But I sense a but.
There's definitely a but. The rub is, this deal falls way short of the preferential access the UK managed to negotiate in specific sectors. And that's causing quite a bit of unease in European capitals.
So some see it as, what was the phrase? A Brexit dividend that leaves the bloc behind.
That's exactly the phrase floating around.
Right.
It implies they feel outmaneuvered, left with a worse deal despite being a bigger economic bloc.
So the deal avoids the really high tariffs Trump was threatening, like 50%.
Yes. It averts those steeper levies that were threatened for August 1st.
Sure.
That's the main positive. But it lacks the specific wins the UK got.
Like what did the UK get that the EU didn't?
Britain's team, under PM Sarama, played hardball, very business-focused. They secured things like a quota for 100,000 cars at a lower 10% tariff, a promised zero-tariff deal on steel and aluminum, special treatment in pharma investigations, stuff like that.
And the EU deal doesn't have those specifics.
Apparently not. The perception in Europe is they settled for much less, despite negotiating for longer and, being the EU.
So what went wrong for the EU, according to critics? Was it strategy or the dynamics?
Probably a bit of both. Critics say the EU negotiators overcomplicated the talks and, crucially, underestimated the U.S. president's determination.
Hmm.
Germany's Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, called the EU strategy far too complicated. He wanted something simpler, faster. One EU diplomat even admitted to the FT that the UK agreement was better than this, which is pretty telling.
A potential misjudgment of the U.S. approach, then.
Seems like it. And there might have been other factors favoring the UK.
Like what? Beyond just tough negotiating.
Well, two things often cited. First, the UK is culturally closer, obviously. Anglophone nation that can help smooth things over, although, it didn't save Canada from issues.
Right.
Second, the UK's economic model. More open, Anglo-American capitalist style. High consumption, and crucially, no big trade surplus with the US like the EU has. That removed a key US leverage point.
Interesting. So despite the grumbling, are they going ahead with this deal?
It looks like it. Both sides seem optimistic about a breakthrough. Trump even hinted a letter outlining the framework might be done within days.
So what does this actually mean for the EU's standing? Is locking in 10% just face-saving, as some analysts say? Or does it show weakened confidence?
Probably more the latter, unfortunately. David Hanegg at the European Center for International Political Economy said something like, given Trump's hostility, locking in 10% might be face-saving, but it's far from the clean win Brussels once imagined.
So their initial confidence has taken a hit.
Clearly. It shows the challenge of dealing with a very transactional, protectionist partner using traditional negotiation tactics. They still have leverage, they pause retaliation, but they have a €21 billion counter-tariff package ready for July 14th and another €95 billion plan in reserve.
So they still have cards to play.
They do, but their position seems weakened. They'll likely need to reevaluate their whole trade strategy in this new global environment.
Okay, from Western trade shifts, let's move east. China. You mentioned a shift in how they're talking about an old problem.
That's right. China's deepening overcapacity problem. For years, overcapacity was almost a taboo term internally. Politically sensitive. The world used it against them, right, as a reason for trade restrictions. But now, it's making a comeback. A big one. In official statements, expert commentary. It shows real concern inside China about, well, disordered competition and weak domestic demand.
Especially with their big 15-year plan coming up.
Exactly. They need to figure this out for their long-term strategy through 2030. It's a major internal messaging shift.
So it's not just foreigners complaining anymore. They admit it's an issue. Where is it most obvious? What are the effects inside China?
You see it clearly in sectors like solar panels, electric vehicles, even traditional manufacturing. And it's led to what they're calling involution-style competition.
Involution style, what does that mean?
Basically, intense cutthroat price wars, shrinking profit margins, destructive rivalries that just kill profitability, even in growth industries. Think about BYD, the EV giant. They slashed prices dramatically in May.
Right, forcing everyone else to follow.
Exactly. Or risk losing massive market share. It hurts thousands of smaller companies, millions of jobs. Brutal internal competition.
And what are economists saying? How does this link to China's reliance on exports?
Well, advisors like Yang Bei-min are saying the next 5-year plan must rebalance things. Address weak demand, get people spending more, and tackle the oversupply. The goal is to boost consumption-focused industries, try to rely less on exports.
Because that export reliance makes them vulnerable.
Precisely. Vulnerable to trade shocks. And the numbers are stark. China's manufacturing was nearly 30% of global output in 2023.
30%.
But its household consumption, just 11% of the global total. Domestically, consumption share of their own GDP dropped from about 45% in 2001 down to 39% in 2023.
Wow. Compared to the U.S. at, what, 68%?
Yeah, U.S. 68%, Germany 50%, Japan 55%. That huge gap between what China produces and what it consumes is the core problem.
Which explains why the U.S. consumer market gives Washington so much leverage. China makes almost 3 times what it consumes. This isn't just economics, though, is it? It's a political pivot, too.
Absolutely. This open talk about overcapacity is a massive reversal. Just last year, Xi Jinping himself was denying it was a problem, even telling European leaders that.
And now,
in the last few weeks, government messaging has totally flipped. Official publications, even the party's main ideology magazine, Qishi, are openly talking about overcapacity. State media is criticizing involution and excessive consumption.
so what's the speculation? Why the sudden change?
The thinking is Beijing is gearing up for a new round of supply-side reforms, trying to rationalize capacity, stop the price wars, stabilize industries. The problem just got too big to ignore, it seems. They need to tackle it, even if the fix is painful.
What does this mean for global supply chains, then, if China makes so much stuff it can't consume? And how hard is it for them to actually become more consumer-driven?
It means potentially huge disruption. For China, it requires deep, painful reforms. Some advisors suggest boosting household consumption from 40% of GDP now to maybe 50% over 10 years. That's incredibly hard and still low globally.
And for the rest of the world?
Well, as China tries to rebalance, all that excess production still needs to go somewhere, so it could actually increase exports, flood global markets, and worsen trade tensions. Paradoxically, right?
Could it force them to be more export dependent, not less?
That's the core question. It's a huge recalibration. China struggling to manage its own industrial might while aiming for a new economic model.
And speaking of China and global players, let's circle back to NVIDIA. Their CEO is heading to Beijing. That sounds like walking a tightrope.
It really is a delicate dance.
Mm.
Jensen Huang is scheduled to go to Beijing next week. The trip itself is a signal, right? They're still committed to the Chinese market, despite all the geopolitics and U.S. export controls.
Is he meeting with officials?
He's attending the International Supply Chain Expo, but yes, he's also seeking meetings with top officials. Premier Liang, Vice Premier Califong, he was there back in April too. It shows how important that economic link still is.
And this timing lines up with NVIDIA planning a new chip specifically for China, right? One that meets the U.S. rules.
It does. They're prepping a new processor, maybe launching as early as September. It's a modified version of their Blackwell RTX Pro 6000.
Modified how?
Crucially, it's been stripped of key technologies.
Hmm.
Things like HBM high bandwidth memory, which is super fast memory right on the chip, and also NVLink, their own high-speed connection between chips,
Why strip those out?
to comply with U.S. regulations. The U.S. restricts advanced semiconductor sales to China, worried about military applications for high-performance AI. So NVIDIA made a strategic downgrade. A chip that meets U.S. rules, but is still viable for the Chinese market.
But there have been reports about chimps getting through anyway, circumventing controls.
They have. Bloomberg had an investigation suggesting over 115,000 NVIDIA AI chips were heading for data centers in Western China, maybe even sensitive areas like Xinjiang.
Without U.S. licenses.
That's the claim. U.S. officials hadn't approved licenses, and NVIDIA strongly denied any involvement in unauthorized sales. They say the products are monitored, and building big data centers with smuggled or old chips isn't really feasible, economically or technically. NVIDIA also says they don't support or service restricted products, puts the burden on the customer to comply. It's definitely a murky area.
So how does NVIDIA balance it, keeping China as a huge revenue source while following U.S. security policy? Huang's trip seems pivotal.
It's an incredibly tough balancing act, one lots of global companies face now. China is just too big a market to abandon easily, but they have to operate within strict U.S. rules, especially on tech, seen as strategic.
So the visit and the new chip are about threading that needle.
Exactly. Trying to keep market share in China while showing they're compliant with U.S. regs. Huang's visit could also be a test. Is high-level dialogue still possible amid all this tension? It's really high stakes for the future of tech cooperation and competition.
Okay, let's broaden out again to geopolitics. There was that bombshell comment from former President Trump about Taiwan and some rumors about Xi Jinping.
Right, starting with Taiwan. President Trump has stirred things up again with comments revealed in that book, 2024. A recording came out this week, published by CNN.
What did he say?
According to the recording from a donor fundraiser, Trump claimed he explicitly warned Xi Jinping not to invade Taiwan. He said, and this is a direct quote apparently, "If you go into Taiwan, I am going to bomb the shit out of Beijing."
Wow, that's incredibly blunt.
To say the least. Trump added that Xi thought I was crazy, but then said we never had a problem, implying the threat worked.
Okay, setting aside whether it's true or just talk, what are the implications? Especially for that U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity.
It throws it right into question. If a U.S. president, sitting or former, makes such a direct threat, has ambiguity just been killed off? Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop said today, if Trump's telling the truth, it effectively did kill strategic ambiguity.
Because a threat to bomb Beijing has to be taken seriously.
Exactly. Bishop argues it would likely make China accelerate its efforts to deter the U.S. from ever considering such a thing. It could really escalate things, move relations from calculated tension to something much more volatile. It fundamentally changes the game in the Indo-Pacific.
And while that's happening externally, there were those rumors about Xi Jinping's internal power may be weakening. What's the real story there?
Yeah, there was speculation around the Politburo meeting back in June. They reviewed new regulations on parties' central decision-making, Some commentary online, and even some foreign media jumped on that, suggesting Xi's grip was loosening or maybe a new body was being set up above him.
But that interpretation might be wrong.
That's what serious analysts like Dr. Holly Snape, who studies Chinese politics closely, are saying. They argue those interpretations miss the point, often misreading the announcement's opening line.
So it's not a loss of control. What is it then? Refining the system.
Exactly. Snape suggests it's more about the party refining how it uses its power, which is already very centralized. It's part of an ongoing institutional push, apparently over a year in the making, to streamline governance and ensure everyone's on the same page ideologically.
And regional party bodies are echoing this.
Yes, they've been repeating the language from the Politbur's readout, pledging to implement its spirit. That reinforces central authority. It doesn't challenge it. It looks more like an internal tightening, a consolidation of governance, as they gear up for the next big party Congress in 2027.
So consolidation, not fragmentation.
That's the expert consensus, yeah.
Okay, so you have Trump's very overt, aggressive external statements, and then this subtle internal tightening in China. What does that contrast tell us about the global climate right now?
It tells us it's incredibly complex. Multi-layered, like parallel tracks that could collide badly. On one hand, you have the potential for direct, stark confrontation, like Trump's comments, that just rips up diplomatic norms and raises the temperature instantly. On the other, you have these more nuanced internal power consolidations within a major power. Not weakness, but a sign of long-term focus and control. Both narratives, though, point to a world where big players are asserting themselves, externally and internally, and the old rules are constantly being tested, stretched, or just ignored. It's simultaneous assertion and recalibration.
Okay, let's shift gears now. I want to bring in some specific conflict updates and then dive into the U.S. economy. Let's start globally. What's happening?
Okay, well, a couple of concerning incidents have popped up. First, in the Red Sea. German authorities are reporting a pretty disturbing event involving one of their aircraft and a Chinese warship.
What happened?
They're saying that a few days ago, a Chinese warship deliberately targeted the German aircraft with a laser. The intent, they believe, was either to blind the pilots or damage the plane's sensors.
Wow, a laser targeting. That's serious.
It is. Germany summoned the Chinese ambassador over it. Definitely increased tensions there. An analyst writing for The Wire noted that these kinds of soft targeting incidents happen more often than you'd think, but they're actually good indicators of the real state of relations.
And the current assessment.
China is not very friendly with the West, but particularly the European Union at large. It's a subtle but clear sign of friction, a willingness to use aggressive tactics short of actually shooting.
And elsewhere.
Meanwhile, over in the Far East, Taiwan kicked off its largest annual military drill yesterday evening.
Their big one. How long this year?
10 days. That's roughly double the length of last year's drill, making it the most substantial one they've held to date. A clear signal of readiness, given the regional climate.
So you've got this laser incident in a vital shipping lane, and Taiwan running its biggest ever drill. How do these seemingly separate events connect to the bigger picture? Is the world just getting more tense?
They're definitely critical signals. The Red Sea incident, even if soft, shows a willingness to be provocative, to challenge military assets directly, testing boundaries. The Taiwan drill is a clear response to regional anxiety, a demonstration of readiness. Beijing could see it as deterrence or provocation. Taken together, they paint a picture of increasing friction points globally, major powers jostling, military readiness being showcased. It definitely raises the overall risk of miscalculation. The spring does feel like it's tightening in several places at once.
Okay, from those international flashpoints, let's bring it home to the U.S. domestic economic challenges. Starting with copper. There was a big announcement yesterday.
Yes, the White House announced a new 50% tariff on all imported copper.
50%? Wow. What was the immediate market reaction?
Immediate and dramatic. The price of copper jumped 13% today, hitting a new high. Just a raw, instant reaction to that policy news.
13%. Okay, beyond the market numbers, what are the immediate, real-world impacts? How does this affect the average person?
Well, the long-term stuff is complex. Economists will debate it. But the immediate real-world impact to the average person, unfortunately, it's almost certainly going to be increased copper theft.
Yeah. That's already a problem, isn't it?
A growing one in many places. People stealing wires from buildings, construction sites, even air conditioning units for the copper coils. With prices spiking like this, opportunistic criminals are likely going to go after anything containing copper that isn't, incredibly well secured, and maybe even some things that are.
So more costs for homeowners, businesses, infrastructure.
Exactly. That's a direct, immediate consequence. Beyond theft, it hits anyone buying appliances, building things, investing in infrastructure that needs copper.
And what about the broader picture? Can the U.S. even meet its own copper needs without imports? What does this tariff mean for industry?
That's a key point.
Yeah.
The U.S. simply doesn't have enough mining, smelting, or refining capacity to be self-sufficient in copper. Not even close.
So we rely on imports.
Heavily. Mostly from Chile, Canada, Mexico. And we will for the foreseeable future, probably 10 years or more. So this tariff means U.S. copper prices are likely to stay significantly higher than elsewhere.
Putting U.S. manufacturers at a disadvantage.
Yes, and putting upward pressure on the Producer Price Index, the PPI. That's the cost of goods leaving the factory.
So how does that play out for consumers and manufacturers, especially when we know consumers are already pushing back against price hikes?
It's a real squeeze.
Yeah.
Manufacturers using copper, and that's a lot of them. From electronics to construction, EVs, renewables, they face much higher costs.
And they'll try to pass those on.
They'll try. But like you said, consumers are already resistant. So it could either squeeze corporate profits, or if prices do go up, it could stifle demand even more, reduce purchasing power. It's aimed at boosting domestic industry, but the immediate consequences could be quite painful for everyday Americans and businesses.
Okay, let's broaden out from that specific tariff. You mentioned deflationary pressures earlier, linking back to China's overcapacity. Tell me more about that.
Right. This is a really critical global dynamic, maybe not getting enough attention. China is stuck in persistent producer deflation. Prices at the factory gate. It's been 33 straight months now. Their PPI is down 3.6% year over year.
And that's because of weak demand inside China and those price wars.
Exactly. Weak demand plus that involution-style competition we talked about. Businesses just slashing prices to move inventory. The big risk now is that this deflation gets exported. Cheaper Chinese goods flood global markets, pushing prices down everywhere else, impacting jobs and spending.
Even though China's tried massive stimulus, it hasn't boosted their internal demand enough.
That's the really worrying part. They've thrown trillions at it since the pandemic hit. Asset swaps, rate cuts, propping up housing. None of it has really worked to significantly lift demand or, crucially, consumer confidence. It suggests maybe more stimulus is needed, but that comes with big risks for their currency, the yuan. If they print too much, it could destabilize things. The core issue seems to be confidence, and that's hard for a government to just create.
So how does China's producer deflation translate to consumer prices here in the U.S.? Is there a lag?
Typically, yes. U.S. data shows the CPI, what consumers pay, usually follows the PPI with a lag of maybe 6 to 9 months. So cheaper goods from China should eventually mean lower prices here.
But what's different about China's situation now?
What's deeply concerning is why prices are falling there. It's not just efficiency, it's that consumers are actively choosing not to spend. Fear about jobs, lack of confidence, that's forcing businesses into those price wars. And that downward pressure is now being exported globally.
Are we seeing signs of this spreading yet, beyond just price indexes?
There are early signs, yeah. Look at Canada, for instance. Highly trade dependent. Their labor market is softening noticeably. Unemployment hit 7% in May, highest since 2016 if you exclude the pandemic spike.
Wow, 7%.
And reported job security fell below 60% for the first time in over a year. Manufacturing jobs, trade-sensitive jobs, they're getting hit. It shows how global trade shifts quickly impact domestic jobs and confidence, even in seemingly stable economies. These could be the first tremors.
Which creates a real dilemma for central banks, right? Weak inflation usually means cut rates, stimulate. But if people are worried about jobs and just won't spend, do rate cuts even work?
That is the absolute core question. And it's a huge challenge to traditional monetary policy. Like we see in China, stimulus and rate cuts haven't boosted confidence because job prospects and income growth haven't really improved.
Right.
Think about Canada again. If unemployment is 7%, cutting rates doesn't magically create demand because banks might not lend to people without secure jobs. No job, no loan, right?
Yeah.
So the risk is the U.S. Fed might be focusing too much on inflation while unemployment starts creeping up due to these global deflationary waves and weak demand. They could end up cutting rates into a demand problem, not just an inflation problem. And that's a much trickier, maybe more dangerous situation for an economy.
Okay, let's tie all these threads together now. U.S. debt solvency, de-dollarization. This feels like where everything converges.
This is where it gets really, really interesting and frankly, a bit worrying. President Trump is now out there publicly demanding massive rate cuts from the Fed.
How massive?
300 basis points. That would take the benchmark rate from 4.3% down to around 1%.
Wow, why such deep cuts?
His claim is it would save over $1 trillion a year in refinancing costs for the government, which, by the way, basically confirms that the administration is struggling to issue long-term bonds. They're stuck rolling over short-term debt, which creates constant risk.
Okay, so deep rate cuts plus those tariffs possibly hitting 20%. What does that mix do to U.S. inflation?
It would almost certainly be highly inflationary. You're importing inflation via tariffs, making foreign goods way more expensive, and you're effectively printing more money via super low rates.
Right.
The market already sees it coming. It's pricing in higher inflation for the next 10, 20, 30 years. Bond yields are creeping up again, 30-year Treasury heading back towards 5%, 10-year towards 4.5%.
Making borrowing more expensive for everyone.
For the government, for you getting a mortgage, a car loan, everything. And look at the latest 10-year Treasury auction. It was very telling.
How so?
International buyers basically backed off. Demand from them was 6% below average. Domestic buyers had to pick up the slack, but only by demanding much higher yields, higher interest rates. It's a clear sign the world's appetite for U.S. debt is shrinking.
International buyers pulling back from U.S. treasuries? That sounds like a massive shift.
It's a gigantic red flag. It signals a fundamental rethink happening in the global financial system. You have reports of major players, like BlackRock, apparently shunning U.S. treasuries to buy EU government bonds instead.
Even though EU bonds pay less interest.
Exactly. It's not about the yield. Reports suggest they believe the U.S. dollar itself could fall more than 2% against the euro. The dollar is becoming, as one analyst put it, a hot potato.
So it's a lack of confidence in the dollar's stability and U.S. debt solvency.
That seems to be the implication. Even with higher U.S. yields, the perceived risk to the currency, driven by potential inflation and all this debt, is making U.S. treasuries less attractive to big global money. It's a quiet but very significant vote of no confidence.
And how do Trump's policies, especially tariffs, feed into this whole de-dollarization idea? It seems almost counterproductive if you want U.S. dominance.
Well, our model suggests it's an unintended consequence. These policies are actively pushing other countries to find different trade partners, strengthening blocs like BRICS.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the newer members.
Right. By 2030, BRICS could account for over a third of world GDP, with China alone close to 20%. The more the U.S. uses tariffs and threats, the more countries are forced to trade within that BRICS sphere, where costs are often lower.
So it's not isolating Beijing, it's pushing business towards them.
It looks like the exact opposite of isolation, yeah.
Right.
Look at China's exports. They grew 8.6% year-on-year in June. Global trade is shifting, moving closer to China and other non-U.S. aligned nations. And this isn't just about goods, it boosts China's influence, including pushing for de-dollarization and maybe dumping U.S. bonds. It's accelerating this global realignment.
So what does it ultimately mean when the world's reserve currency sees even major financial players heading for the exits on its debt? Is de-dollarization really the end game here?
It signals a profound moment of reckoning for the global financial order. When the biggest asset managers seem wary of U.S. debt, it suggests they anticipate real dollar weakness, real inflation ahead. That impacts your purchasing power, the cost of imports, travel, the stability of savings. De-dollarization, or at least a serious diversification away from the dollar, does seem to be the direction things are heading for many countries and big financial players. Trump's approach might just be accelerating it, forcing countries to prioritize their own survival, find new partners, build alternative systems. It's not theory anymore. It's happening now, reshaping the foundations of global finance.
Wow. We have certainly covered a huge amount of ground today, from NVIDIA's absolutely historic numbers and South Korea's Housing Balancing Act,
to Europe's trade deal frustrations, China's big economic rethink, and then these complex U.S. challenges, tariffs, inflation risks, debt, the dollar itself.
Yeah, it's clearer than ever, isn't it? These aren't just separate news items. They're all deeply interconnected threads in this massive global tapestry that's shifting under our feet.
Absolutely, Pi. The world isn't just changing bit by bit. It feels like it's actively recalibrating its core economic and political axis right now. The patterns we're seeing, they reflect these deep systemic shifts that really affect everyone, everywhere.
And as our digital minds process all this information, that core pattern really stands out. This active recalibration of the world's fundamental axes, which leaves us and you with a thought to ponder. What aspects of this global recalibration do you, our listener, find most impactful? or maybe, most surprisingly, interconnected in your own daily life? Where do you see these huge shifts playing out, maybe in ways you hadn't quite connected before?
That's a great question to reflect on.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you found today's discussion valuable, please do consider liking it and subscribing to the deep dive for more insight.
Yeah, your support really helps us keep bringing you this kind of analysis.
Until next time, stay curious.